Welcome to the Conscious Publicist Podcast, a space where thoughts become ideas to advocate for a more conscious human experience in the media. Our thoughts and ideas inspire action, and the most notable leaders and organizations have transformed thoughts and ideas into global initiatives that have impacted the lives of millions. My name is Ashley Graham, and as a woman-owned business founder and publicist, I guide leaders, visionaries, and creators in discovering their conscious media voice and methodologies that inspire connection, community, and impact through aligned media channels. In this podcast, we'll dive into public relations, thought leadership, business, and entrepreneurship, all through the lens of being a conscious human being. I'll take you behind the scenes into the habits, thoughts, and modalities that have helped leaders shift past paradigms of limiting beliefs, comparison, and self-doubt to show up for themselves to become the subject matter experts they were called to be. Subscribe to the show on Apple or Spotify and join us on this journey of awakening the conscious, enlightened leader within you. Opening up the dialogue with a moment of reflection is I want to share that my heart is with you if you and your loved one have clicked on this episode to seek your own guidance through pregnancy loss or miscarriage. What I have learned through now 2 miscarriages within 5 months of one another is that even though there are resources and medical professionals out there, as well as women and families who are opening up their own dialogue to share what this experience is like for them, we as individuals are still on a path of deep discovery and personal symbolism of what this experience is like for us. And it's an experience that comes with many moments of confusion and a scale of complex emotions, as well as identity shifts that come with this experience, and it can be quite challenging. So again, I want to say that if you're here because you are seeking guidance or simply want to know that you're not alone, my heart is with you. You're certainly not alone, and I hope that by me sharing my story, it's able to bring you some type of solace you may need. I also want to leave a little disclaimer to say that this episode will indeed be sharing and encompassing my own raw personal experience of miscarriage. And through sharing experiences that are heavy, especially on the emotions, this could evoke other strong emotions and could be distressing for some listeners. So please listen with an open mind and heart and be mindful of your own emotional well-being while tuning in. If you find the subject too difficult to engage with, please close the audio and you're more than welcome to return when you feel ready. And remember again, you're not alone, and medical and emotional support is available when needed. A few days ago, I had shared on Threads that I was really feeling the blocks on recording my miscarriage story for Pregnancy Loss Awareness Month. I received quite a few responses from other women who were so supportive and acknowledging that sharing a raw experience, especially around pregnancy loss or miscarriage, can indeed come with its challenges. But I will say that I knew that I wanted to share my story for this month because I love what this month represents. Now I'm a little behind on sharing this story because of those blocks that surfaced. But what I've really done was I've made it a point to come back to the why. And that why really is this realization that there's transformation that comes with sharing our personal narratives. And it's not just for us to gain deeper insights of what our experiences are like for new insights and new discoveries, but it's a way to mirror that experience with others who know exactly what that experience entails. It's a way to build deeper connections and deeper understandings between one another. And when we find that we're not alone and that we are around people who understand us, we feel seen, we feel heard, and we feel supported in a way unlike anything else. So, to shift into actually sharing my story today, I have found that when I am experiencing blocks around using my voice, especially through an experience that is relatable but also significant, is to create anchors for that conversation. One of the first anchors that I want to bring into this space right now is to reference the miscarriage story that I had wrote for Simply Ashley Graham. For me, especially when it comes to sharing experiences that have taken me back either emotionally or psychologically, is to transcribe it. Transcribing for me comes a lot easier because it brings my greatest skill set to the forefront, which is writing. And writing for me is so much more simplistic when it comes to adding a voice to an experience. So when I had sat down to write my miscarriage story, it felt like words flew on paper. I love this article because I was able to encapsulate these anchor points in the story itself of past, present, and future. What I had shared in that article was my manifestation journey into motherhood that started about 4 years, almost 5 years ago. During the pandemic, at that time, I was living down in San Diego, and I was in the process of making my move to Orange County, which is only about an hour north for those who aren't familiar with Southern California and the distances between the two. I felt called to Orange County through many spiritual awakenings that were taking place at that time and during that time frame. However, one of the most significant visions that came to me or came through me was during the move itself, when I had gotten this beautiful, wonderful feeling and vision that motherhood and marriage were actually awaiting for me during that move. If you go back and listen to the story that I had shared about manifesting my fiance's soon-to-be husband, Ali, is that when I had met him, and even before I had met him, I had received many visions that showed me this path to meeting him, but even more so confirming that he was a part of that feeling and that vision from the beginning. For me, I lead a lot of my life when it comes to spiritual shifts or these visions that come to mind that really anchor this connection between my mind, body, and soul. When I feel these feelings, especially in my mind, body, and soul, is I know that there is a manifestation or a transformation that's about to take place. So during that relocation from San Diego to Orange County, and just overall feeling that marriage and motherhood was waiting for me, I decided to create a couple of intentional shifts for my life. I had noted this in the article. I labeled them as intentions, but there were a number of intentions that I had made before the move, but also after the move, to be in full support to become a mother. I am about to reach my 3-year anniversary of saying goodbye to alcohol. And one of the main reasons that I wanted to say goodbye to alcohol was because I wanted to have a very clear womb space for bringing life into creation. I actually plan to share more about that experience and what that journey was like come December, because I'm planning to do a couple of pieces to celebrate that anniversary. But when I had made that decision, it was a decision that was probably one of the easiest ones to make. Another decision or intention that I made was getting off of birth control. I actually got off birth control during the pandemic before the move, and although I didn't have a partner at that time, it seemed like a very easy decision to say goodbye to birth control. And given that I had an IUD for many years, I read that there could be one of two paths that would happen for a woman on her journey to conception following birth control, especially having an IUD. With an IUD specifically, I had read that either you can get pregnant very easily and quickly, or it could take some time, i.e. a few years. So given that I knew the timeline shifts and jumping of timelines, I wanted to give my body enough time to heal and get back to a normal cycle before even trying to get pregnant when I met my partner. So those were some of the points that I had talked about in my article. You are more than happy to go back and read a little bit more specifics of that story, but what I was calling it my manifestation journey into motherhood, because manifestation really comes down to being intentional about the actions, decisions, beliefs, and the habits that you are building and creating before that manifestation actually occurs or comes into fruition. So I wanted to give myself plenty of time to clear out the old energetic space to welcome in the new. As for the second anchor of this story, is I want to bring awareness into the influence of this year and what it's been like for me. I actually just shared a story on Instagram and shared it on Threads as well, that when the voice and body shakes when sharing your personal narrative, that's how you know what you're sharing is needed. The blocks on sharing my miscarriage stories have been very heavy, but I'm realizing that through this dialogue right now that I'm reaching the breakthrough for this episode. And although I've been behind on sharing this story for Pregnancy Loss Awareness Month, late truly is better than never. And I'm quite grateful it took me some time, because what I'm about to share is quite enlightening. What I want to bring awareness to is that there are parallels to pregnancy loss. It's not just about the physical or the emotional impacts of the loss itself. It's so much deeper than that. What I want to share through both of my miscarriage stories is to bring light to the depths of what these losses have entailed. Starting with the first pregnancy is I had received the positive pregnancy test just 3 weeks after the memorial for my dear friend who passed early February. During that bereavement trip, I actually extended my trip to visit my family back in Missouri. And during that trip, I noticed that there were many changes taking place in my body that I have never experienced before. Although I was just about 2 weeks in with the missed period, and given that I had been regular with my cycle since getting off birth control, I had a pretty good idea of what was going on. Nonetheless, my fiance and I went to the pharmacy to get a set of pregnancy tests. We took one on a Sunday evening and the other following the next day, and both were positive. In my true nature, I didn't want to get overly excited, as false positives can happen, so I scheduled a pregnancy test at the doctor, and they came in the room and said that my test lit up immediately. As I sat in the room soaking in the news, the doctor gave me a piece of paper that enclosed the conception date. When I looked at the date on paper, my heart burst and I felt a wave of joy, but also immense amount of grief. Our conception date was within the same week of my friend's passing, and as a very intuitive and spiritual person, I couldn't help but feel like this pregnancy was a gift from the other side. Over the years, my friend and I had enjoyed many conversations about motherhood and many jokes about motherhood as well. When I saw that conception date, I joked that even on the other side, my friend was still advocating for me to enter motherhood. I could have gone on and on about this part of the story in my miscarriage article, but I wanted to put more of the emphasis on the actual miscarriage of that news. But what I want to share here on the podcast is that my dear friend CJ was such a light of a person. He had this energy that could capture the attention of anybody in the room. He just was naturally a bright soul. Some of the conversations that we have had over the years of our friendship was jokes about how many children that I would mother in my lifetime. And I always responded that I wanted just a few, max two. But the joke and reoccurring joke that became a thing was that he would always joke that I was going to have multiple children. And I'm talking like two handfuls. Now, when I had met Allie and Allie was introduced to my friend CJ, that joke took on a greater form. And the last day that I actually saw my dear friend, we had actually taken this picture, and both him and my fiance Allie were holding up their palm of their hand, signaling the number 5. So through the jokes over the years turned into a joke then between my fiance and CJ, talking about how many children that we would have together. And we had settled jokingly on the number 5. Now, fast forward to my dear friend's funeral. It was a funeral that I could not miss. I needed to be in that room to physically, emotionally, spiritually say goodbye and honor him. And as I was listening to his brother talk about stories about his brother, I noticed that there was a common thread between the number 5 and CJ holding up a palm, signaling the number 5. So I, during that funeral, not knowing that I was already pregnant, was feeling so many emotions and mourning, not only losing him in this physical reality, but there was this creation of threads and parallels between who he was, this joke that he then had with his family that in turn turned into a joke of its own form in my life and my fiance's life. So to sit in that office that day, to see that conception date was roughly around his passing, it felt that CJ was with me in those moments. And he helped bring that first pregnancy, that first baby into my life. I'll be sure to touch upon this as I get to the experience with the second pregnancy and the second miscarriage, but there really is no pain like losing your first pregnancy. It's a club that I never thought that I would enter or be a part of in my life. Granted, I think it would have been a lot easier, and I say that lightly, but it would have been a lot easier to lose a second or third pregnancy and not the first. One of the things that I wanted to close with the introduction or the story of the first pregnancy before we received the news of the miscarriage was that with the first pregnancy, it brings so much excitement for the parents to be. I will say that my fiance and Allie, we have always had the shared dream and vision to become parents. For some perspective, on our first date, we talked about our hopes, our dreams, and our aspirations to be married and to have children and to talk about how many children we wanted. It was something that was so easy and so natural to talk about with one another. So you can only imagine how clear that dream and that purpose became when we saw that positive pregnancy test. Now, what I have shared in that article is that there was this divinity and this beauty that my body started transforming through creating life. I noticed that my pregnancy sensations began well before the pregnancy test, but they became more pronounced as the days went on. My fiance, Allie, and I, we really became the observers of my body, giving it all that it needed and desired, trusting that each step and decision we were making at the time was setting us up on the right path towards parenthood. Now, fast forward a couple weeks after the positive pregnancy test at the doctor's office, we had scheduled our first ultrasound for April 2nd. We sat in the room with the doctor and we were able to gaze at the screen to see a little nugget floating around, and it felt very surreal in that moment. Given that our ultrasound took place around 9 to 10 weeks of the pregnancy, the nurse had mentioned that I was only measuring at 6 weeks and proceeded to express that it could have been that I had a late ovulation period. What I had come to find out after that moment was it was their way to ease into what I was about to be told with another nurse. Allie and I were able to luckily see the ultrasound together, but they had escorted him out of the room so that way I could get dressed and talk to another practitioner, and that's when miscarriage became part of the conversation. I sat in the chair to wait for the other nurse to return, and as she entered the room with an energy quite unsettling for a highly intuitive like myself, she gave me news that immediately brought me to grief. What was expressed with very little empathy, she told me that they couldn't detect a heartbeat during the ultrasound. Then I heard the words miscarriage exit her mouth and I froze immediately. Hearing the word miscarriage had felt that it was echoed and reverberated off the walls in slow motion. Never in my life would I have imagined hearing those words as part of my life experience. However, I tried to sit there to be as present as possible and not allow my emotions to come flowing through. She then proceeded to talk about treatment to remove the baby, and it felt like my heart stopped. I didn't have what felt like any time or space to process the possibility of a miscarriage in the first place, let alone the process or treatment to remove it. So you can imagine I started noticing my body was going into fight or flight. However, I feel that once she saw the stone look on my face, she proceeded to say that we could schedule another ultrasound for a week later to see if the pregnancy progressed and if we would hear a heartbeat before making a decision. And as I could hardly think, I agreed to schedule a follow-up ultrasound exactly a week later and left the facility in utter disbelief and a very deep feeling of mourning. The thing is, knowing that Allie and I were separated, poor Allie was sitting in the waiting room waiting for me to come out of the office, and seeing me in the condition that I was in put him in a little bit of shock. Given that our experience together was that we had just saw the ultrasound, we saw the fetus, we saw the pregnancy sac, so to see me in that state left him quite worried. We had gotten to the car and I sat there and just cried and let it all come out. And I tried my best to explain what they had said to me in the room through very clouded thoughts and sobbing words. And we did our best to stay positive and hopeful for the next week. However, knowing the possibility of our rescan, I honestly really couldn't shake the heavy and heartbreaking feeling that it was not going to be our time. As you can imagine, we walked into the clinic for the second ultrasound on April 10th, and what I hoped would be another step towards meeting our long-awaited miracle turned into the journey of acceptance through receiving the most disheartening news that a hopeful mother could hear. There was still no heartbeat. The tiny life inside me hadn't grown since the week before, and I was met with this journey where time really felt like it stood still, and I entered a new reality I never asked for. The days and the weeks that turned into months actually were a blur of conflicting emotions. There were days where I felt emotions of deep sadness and mourning of a future that felt really uncertain in that time. But there was also anger, which has never been an emotion that I have processed or felt easily. And the anger, I think, was the most challenging emotion to experience because it was an overwhelming sense of injustice and unfairness. And it was the most complicated feeling to shake. You know, where the anger and the feeling of injustice and unfairness came from is because I had paved a life for calling in motherhood and pregnancy for years leading up to that moment. I had been intentional in my journey, but Ali also had been intentional as in his journey, in which we created this dynamic where we really lived intentionality through the journey becoming parents, where we put our hearts and souls into every step of the process. It takes a lot of courage to share this type of feeling, but it really felt like we were robbed of something so precious and something that was so rightfully ours. Grief is a journey that I'm learning more and more every single day, even through the process of getting through the intense waves of grief. But grief is a very complex, multifaceted experience. There have been moments where I've felt everything from profound loss to just utter disgust at the unfairness of it all. That week on April 10th was the start of a difficult journey expanding over weeks, and it was a journey that tested my faith, my resilience, and it forced me to confront new depths of pain and my abilities to feel pain. I want to make note here that I do want to go into the actual experience of the passing of the miscarriage, which I have come to find that it's a spiritual awakening of its own kind. There are going to be some fairly graphic details that I share, so if it's something that you're not comfortable with listening to at this time, I highly encourage to tune out or maybe fast forward to another time if you're curious to continue listening to my journey. But the physical passing of the miscarriage, at least my first miscarriage, was an experience unlike anything I've ever encountered before. The passing experience required me to advocate for my body and trust its natural ability to handle what was happening. I was given 3 options from the doctor or the clinic to either allow my body to pass the miscarriage naturally, take a medication to abort the pregnancy to induce miscarriage, or to go in for what is called a D&C procedure. I decided to wait and let the miscarriage pass naturally because I'm more of a naturopathic person, and I do believe in trusting my body's wisdom to navigate and to do what it needs to do. A week and a half after my last ultrasound on April 10th, I began to experience slight bleeding, a signal that the process had begun. For several days, the bleeding was minimal, accompanied by mild cramping, which didn't match the intensities others had described. A little delusional in my thinking, I assumed that perhaps I was one of the more fortunate ones who might go through this without too much physical pain. However, I was very wrong, which more on that later. I called in the article on Simply Ashley Graham that there were different waves. So the first wave, following the light spotting and light cramping, that Sunday, thinking that I was in the clear to go about my day as normal, Allie and I decided to go to the beach to relax and give me a break from being bedridden, which I had been bedridden for weeks due to just intense fatigue through the first trimester and then, lo and behold, grief after the news. As we lounged on the sand, I suddenly felt large gushes of liquid, so intense that I had to hunch my way to the restroom. I didn't really know exactly what was going on, what to think, as it was not followed by any cramping or any pain. The beach that we were at had a public restroom that had a line of women out the door waiting to use the restroom. So I had to stand in line And I immediately was struck by this surreal nature of the moment. I was surrounded by people enjoying a beautiful day, completely unaware of the profound loss and physical experience I was enduring. I like to bring awareness to the world around me, especially in moments like that. And I just kept having this thought that there were so many people at the beach that day that nobody would really understood or could understand what I was going through in that moment. I felt extremely isolated and alone in front of dozens of people, even around my fiance. And it was just a very eye-opening experience. And that was before I had even knew or had noticed what was going on. What I would like to say is the second wave is I had went into the restroom and I had noticed that there was a palm-sized sac and clot in my underwear. The moment that I felt those gushes and it left my body, it felt like a big, intense physical release, unlike anything that I had experienced. It was as though a heavy weight had been lifted, which did leave me feeling lighter and more relaxed, and to my surprise, somewhat relieved. I was actually quite taken back and astonished that it had happened without the intense pain and bleeding I had been warned about. Maybe it was the serene environment of the beach that seemed to act as a significant environment for release. And all this to say, it gave me some strange sense of peace amidst the turmoil of what I had been feeling since receiving the news. However, lo and behold, there was a third wave. The journey wasn't over. A few days later, I was awakened to an experience that would become the most excruciating experience of my life. On Thursday evening following that Sunday, there were these intense cramping that begun, and quickly they turned into powerful contractions that lasted nearly 4 hours. The pain seemed very relentless, and nothing, ibuprofen, heating pads, hot showers, brought any relief to me. It was so severe that my fiance and I were moments away from heading to the ER. In a moment of clarity, we called the on-call nurse instead, desperate for guidance, as we really did not want to end up in an ER room while I was experiencing this pain and uncertainty of what was to follow. Luckily, the nurse provided us support and assured us that I could continue to let this experience play out at home as long as I was not experiencing a fever, any body chills, or anything of the sorts, as long as I wasn't feeling weak. I endured these contractions from 8:30 p.m. until almost midnight, culminating in the final release. Despite being only 6 weeks pregnant, what my body expelled was quite surprising and unimaginable that no doctor or any nurse would have been able to explain this experience and what it was going to turn into. However, like I said, I do my part and I make it a point to try to look for the meaning in very painful and confusing experiences. And as harrowing as this experience was, mind, body, soul, spirit, for all of them, this physical release felt like a rite of passage. It was a pretty profound and painful awakening of its own kind. What I had expressed in the article was I described it as it was as though I had crossed a threshold where my body and my spirit were forever changed. The process was raw, intense, and deeply personal. It felt personal to me, but also brought a strange sense of closure. I had physically and emotionally endured the loss, and although the grief had still lingered and still lingers to this day, I do feel that I continue to emerge from the experience with a greater and new vitalized understanding of my own physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual strengths. Ultimately, this journey, at least the first miscarriage, had deepened my connection to my body, spirit, and what I like to call the sacredness of life and loss. That part of my story is transcribed in the article, so you will notice that there are overlaps between the audio and written word. But bringing awareness to what I had mentioned earlier on in the episode is to touch upon the parallel of this experience. I believe that there are paralleled experiences that happen through moments of loss, and that exactly was a part of my journey, and lo and behold, is still a part of my journey to this day. The day that I had started miscarrying, that day at the beach, was the day that my grandmother ended up becoming bedridden in the hospital bed through her decline with Alzheimer's and dementia. I have only talked about this with very close friends and family, but I became acutely aware of observing my healing journey through other timelines that were happening in my life. My recovery process with the first miscarriage lasted about 2 months consecutively, at least the physical passing. And the end of July 2024 was actually when I had received my cycle, and it was just a few weeks after my grandmother passed. However, during the beginning of part of the recovery process, I had went home to visit my family, and I noticed that there was a deeper connection that was taking place with my grandmother in those moments. My grandmother is the only woman in my family who has experienced miscarriage. And through this experience, knowing that through her end of life, I was still recovering from my first miscarriage, it brought me such a deeper understanding of what my grandmother had gone through in her life. During the last few weeks of her life that I was able to be a part of, like I said, was still going through my recovery process, and I was able to really energetically blend into her and her energy and presence in those moments. Although I was not able to talk through this experience with her, which is something that I wanted and desired so greatly, it felt like I could divinely connect with her because it felt like we both lost a part of us at the exact same time. For context, my grandmother is and was my best friend, and I'll still say that she still is. She's just with me here at a different depth, but it felt like I was being passed a torch to carry on this legacy in some way, given that her and I share a similar experience with one another. I felt that I had gained this greater understanding of pain and loss that she had experienced in her life. And it was almost as if through nonverbal communication, she had seen me in this new light like I was able to see her. The miscarriage, the pregnancy, all of it happened so quickly, and it was all in parallel to grief in other forms. My dear friend CJ's passing turned into the pregnancy, turned into miscarriage, turned into my grandmother's passing, and it continues from there. Following my grandmother's funeral, it felt like life and my spirituality had taken on a whole new form. Like I said, my spiritual activations usually elevate through moments like grief and loss, but then also very positive and uplifting experiences as well. But I started to notice the ways of communication that were taking place with my grandmother. There were amazing dreams that she came to visit me in to show me what felt like glimpses of the future. I also was able to get signs and synchronicities around me when I would think about her or feel her presence, which was actually a very beautiful engagement and still is to this day. One of the dreams that I will never forget is I had actually forgotten the dream until about mid-morning the next day, but I had looked down at a very plump, pregnant belly, holding my stomach with just so much love, and I noticed that her hands came behind me and placed right on top of mine, holding my belly and baby. This dream was so significant in the sense that it came at a time where I really felt like I was through the ebbs and flows of the grief of the miscarriage. And it felt that I was also given a glimpse of, like I said, what was on the horizon. A few weeks go by, and my grandfather had passed very suddenly, which took me back into a spiral of loss and mourning. But there also was a beautiful surprise on the other end. It was the week of my grandfather's funeral that I started to notice very similar sensations and feelings in my body. I went through the motions and observations of what was going on, and it felt like this innate knowing and intuition like I've never experienced before. I knew I was pregnant and I was just waiting for confirmation. So the day after my grandfather's funeral, I had taken a pregnancy test, and sure enough, it was positive. This was quite surprising in the sense that I did not imagine that I would be able to get pregnant again, especially so quickly. There were only a few weeks from what felt like my recovery process ending into receiving a normal cycle. So to get pregnant again so quickly was quite a surprise. But nonetheless, I celebrated it as much as I could have while still mourning the loss of my grandfather. But there were a couple of dreams that I had just days after his passing where he presented himself to me and he looked at me with just this admiration and emotion that just warms my heart but also breaks it at the same time. After I had received that positive pregnancy test, the looks that I remembered from those dreams was almost as if he knew a secret that I didn't know. And once I noticed that I was pregnant, it almost as felt that was the sign that he was trying to communicate with me through the look. Now, Allie and I returned back to California, and we again went through the motions of being very mindful of what I ate and getting exercise and getting rest and being as relaxed as I possibly could while still mourning and awaiting what the next steps would be for doctor's visits and everything that follows. In comparison with my first pregnancy, I had noticed a vastly different feeling in my body. I did not experience the fatigue like I experienced the first pregnancy. I did not experience the extreme lows and the extreme morning sickness like I felt the first time around. If anything, this pregnancy resembled what I had always envisioned, and part of those visions leading up to motherhood was that it felt expansive and it felt joyful, and it just felt like this very beautiful, beautiful experience. So you can imagine that going through the weeks, it felt like we were on the right track. Now, I had discovered that October was Pregnancy Loss Awareness Month through my recovery process with the first miscarriage. And I was so excited to bring my story to what this month represents. However, the last few days of September leading into the first few days of October, I had started miscarrying. And I will say that I am extremely grateful that I did not experience any of the physical feelings like I did the first time around, but I did notice something quite significant that really changed my spiritual understanding of what this experience is and represents. I want to express that the first miscarriage for me was most certainly more abrasive physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, which is why I felt that it took on a whole new understanding once I got through the grieving process, that it was, or what felt like, a rite of passage. I needed to experience that experience to understand what my strength is capable of overcoming. Even through my extreme lows and the complexity of the emotions I felt, especially anger, is it taught me to really understand my emotion and myself at greater depths. I believe that we can learn a lot about ourselves through the not so perfect moments, and this just happened to be an experience that I needed to go through to understand myself at depths that I didn't before. Leading up to the second miscarriage, like I said, there was what felt like an unlocking of more spiritual communication that was taking place in my life. Not only was my grandmother tuning in with me in ways that she could, alongside my grandfather, but I started to get dreams and visits from my spirit child that felt very similar, like I've experienced before. When I talk about the visions that I received from moving to Orange County and years leading up to meeting Allie, was I got many visits from my spirit child, which aided into that intentionality to bring that child into the world. However, I know that it's not up to me. It's at the readiness of that child and their spirit. But I really wanted to do what I could do in order to call them in. Those visits from that spirit child were very frequent the first years leading up to meeting Allie, but those visits dissipated when I met him. Now, knowing that I'll never really have the answers as to why, I came to believe that it was because I was with the partner that this child was going to come through with, that they didn't really need to be as present with me because they were working on now manifesting into the physical world. To give you some context as to the visions that I used to have, I used to see my child, my daughter, running around my apartment at very odd hours of the night. I used to be very much a night owl at that time frame, where I was usually in my office working, and with the light on, I could always see the shadow and a figure of a small child that resembled what I thought was a daughter, very feminine energy, running around my home. I also had these dreams where I saw my daughter consoling me in a moment where I was feeling very sad and mourning, something that wasn't very clear in the dream. But what I could hear was I could hear her say, "Mommy, it's okay. I'm here and you're going to meet me soon." I also saw her wrap her arms around me as if she was hugging me and comforting me from behind. That dream and those moments became so significant in my life that I actually went to see a medium and I wanted confirmation on if that spirit was attached to me or if it could have been energy that was lingering from a home or presence before me. And my medium had said that she actually saw the vision of the daughter. She had this long, wavy, golden hair, very delicate, very innocent energy, and she saw a light next to my uterus. Now, this was back in 2021. That reading that I had gotten with that medium actually was in August/September of 21, which was just 3 months before having a dream and vision of Allie, and I met him a month later. So a lot of those visits actually became more apparent about 4 or 5 months leading into meeting Allie. They were here and there once I got settled into Orange County back in 2020, but they became very strong, very significant, like I said, about 4 or 5 months before meeting him. Now, meeting Allie and fast forwarding to just a few months ago, if not just back in September, is those visits became less and less. And if they were visits, I wasn't as cognizant of them, or it was really hard to tell exactly the meaning of the visits. But after having the dream of my grandmother holding my stomach and the dreams about my grandfather giving me this look of divine love and understanding and respect and admiration, the visits started coming back. About a week before I started miscarrying with the second pregnancy, I had a dream that I was cooing inside my stomach or towards my stomach, and I could hear the baby respond by echoing the coos that I had made. Now, I know that that's not physically possible, but for me, it was this beautiful engagement that I had with my baby. And it showed me in that moment that we are still able to connect with our children even before the birthing process. So for me, it became this form of communication that turned into something very beautiful. And here is what I've decided to do with that. Call it intuition or call it just the natural healing process of experiencing so much grief, one experience right after another, is that the second miscarriage just felt more of a glimpse into what was to come or what is to come. It's really hard to put into words, and bear with me and forgive me because there's no better way to say this, but I noticed that in conjunction with that last cooing dream, I wanted to put an identity or a phrase into what to call our baby. You hear pregnant families, they will call their baby Nugget or Peanut or all of these cutesy little names because there's this space that a family goes through before they've been able to determine the gender and go through the natural process of creating an identity for that child. Now, I wanted something that just felt very special, something very unique. And there was this term that kept coming to mind, and I started calling our little baby our little Pearl. That was about, like I said, about a week before I started miscarrying. So about 2-3 days into miscarrying, I actually saw the baby this time around. I did not see a fetus in the first miscarriage. It was almost as if my body had actually absorbed it, and I just saw the sac of the tissue that was in the womb. But I actually saw the baby. I saw that it probably stopped growing roughly around 5 or 6 weeks, again, based off of the size of what they look like at that gestational state. And inside the sac, I could see the baby that was about the size of a pearl. Now, I went through very much a grieving, mourning process in that moment while I looked at it and held it. I know how odd that can sound, but in its own way, it was very therapeutic and very healing. I also showed Allie, and he also looked at it, and we had this moment of embrace together of just comforting one another. And it just really brought that experience through in a more emotional and spiritual way because we could actually see what was growing inside my womb. Just hours later, I actually just felt like there was this light switch had just gone off within me, within my essence, within my aura, that it was almost as if these experiences needed to happen to show our child, to show our spirit baby that they are going to be so loved through parents who are such stable energies for one another. And there's so much that we unlock to this experience, both individually and collectively. And it's through now 2 losses in this nature that Allie and I have grown even greater strengths individually, but even more so collectively. It is almost as if there was this shining light that just went off to show that this is what needed to happen in order to show that child just how much strength, love, and compassion that we have in this home for bringing that life here into reality. As the days went on, as I was still miscarrying, yes, there was still moments of mourning and moments of grief, but I started continuing to get even more visits. One of the dreams that I had, which was actually it was about the middle of the miscarriage process. So I think about maybe 2 or 3 days after the baby had come out, is I saw this little girl about the same height as the shadow child that used to love capturing my attention while I was working late in my office. Same hair length, same essence, same vibrance, and you just saw her holding both Allie and I's hand. We were walking her across a parking lot to go and get an ice cream cone at some ice cream shop. And she just kept looking at him and I with just this beaming, bright face, this smile that expanded from ear to ear. And the only thing that I could hear actually in the dream from a clairaudience perspective is I can just hear her laugh and her sound. And it immediately made me think about the cooing dream where I just heard just this beautiful, beautiful sound that came from my womb and my stomach. Now, this experience is so heavy for women because it is vastly different from one another. And I am a really good example of that. My first miscarriage was so heavy and so daunting, and it felt like I could barely claw myself out of it. And so knowing going into the second pregnancy that was very much a possibility of being our reality again, I chose not to live in that. I honored it and I acknowledged it because it needed to be acknowledged. But I focused on my body and I focused on my excitement and I focused on the things that are not tangible. It's that experience, that spiritual experience that is more in essence of who I truly am. It's how my heart ticks. It's how my heart lives. So going through the miscarriage, yes, it was hard. There were moments where I grieved, but it felt very much like what I hope to be the book of loss through pregnancy loss closing. If for any reason it happens again, I'm sure that it will teach me more and it'll show me more. But my path forward became even more clear than it was with the first miscarriage. I thought I was very clear in that moment that I was ready to be a mother and it was going to be fully received, but that receptivity took on a whole new form with the second one. I have created a path and a plan forward to show that child, to show the universe and whatever else is out there that I am dedicated to doing whatever I need to do to bring that spirit into creation, to be able to be loved and honored and cherished and respected from 2 parents who know what it's like to experience such deep loss with one another. That baby is going to be so, so loved. If I would have sat down to record this episode just a few months ago before receiving the second pregnancy, I believe the narrative of this would be vastly different. And so I believe in the natural evolution of healing and that the time to share this story today was always meant to come at a time where it felt like there was a deeper why behind sharing it. I had touched upon this, that it's like this experience is vastly different for each woman and each family and each partnership. And I'm in some support groups where I just hear every single day and see posts from other women going through multiple losses in a row. And it's as if we have a community of just kindred spirits who know exactly what this experience is like. But one of the reasons why I wanted to hop on here today, again, better late than never, to share this message is just to share more or less a beacon of hope and a beacon of understanding that even through the moments of loss and confusion and just heaviness where it feels like you are fighting to get out of the mud, there will be these moments of clarity, these moments of hope and love and meaning and purpose, that some of these things happen to unlock greater understandings of who we are and how committed we are to calling in some of the new identities that we will experience in our lifetime. I want to briefly acknowledge that there is a section in the article that I wrote on Simply Ashley Graham, which really talks to the loneliness of loss, especially through miscarriage grief and finding love and connection into what is waiting on the other side of that heavy experience, like pregnancy loss and miscarriage. My first miscarriage was actually probably the most loneliest experience I have ever felt in my life. But as I hopefully was able to convey, is I have been able to find some very beautiful experiences and outlooks and perspectives through vast loss in a very short time frame. I have felt and am realizing that there were paralleled connections through every loss that I've experienced this year. Through the common thread between losing my friend, the first pregnancy, the first miscarriage, losing my grandmother, losing my grandfather, experiencing the second pregnancy and then miscarriage, is it all lives and breathes love, and love that I have had, which with each of these people, each of these moments, and each of these souls. So to get to this perspective of love, understanding, and compassion, it's a beautiful place to be in, and I believe that that is what loss is here to teach us. This is by far the longest episode that I have ever published on the podcast, but I really felt that this needed to be shared, not only for myself, but for others to gain a different perspective around pregnancy loss and miscarriage. These experiences will never not be a part of me. I don't think I will ever not grieve these losses, the same as I will never not grieve losing my loved ones in this physical world, being very much that we are still physical beings. But grief through these experiences do show us how driven and motivated we are to bringing our children into this world, to love and honor them the same ways that we were loved and are loved and honored from the close people in our lives. This is an invitation to hop on over to the article. You'll notice that I share a little bit more insights into the connection to all these chapters of my journey. Now, it was written in the context and timeline before my second pregnancy and miscarriage, but I do believe that the narrative still holds true. Essentially, like I want to convey to wrap this up, is I was driven to share this narrative and story today to help other people who are experiencing pregnancy loss and miscarriage like I have, to be able to give themselves grace and love and as much self-compassion as they possibly can, or that you possibly can, because there is no guidebook to this experience, and we are left to experience this journey in whatever ways that we are meant to experience them. As for some resources to find a community of those to turn to for encouragement and love and guidance through this, is you can hop on over to the Peanut app. That actually was one of the first platforms that I joined to fumble my way into feeling like I wasn't alone. There are groups to join to talk through all of the parts of this experience, and also find potentially some connections and friends along the way who know exactly what this experience is like and who can be there to hold you and guide you in the ways that you may need. There are also some other incredible resources that will be shared in hopefully an episode following this one. And I just want to give an invitation that I am pretty active over on Instagram threads at Simply Ashley Graham. If you ever want to create a dialogue or have questions, or just want to talk about what this experience is like for you and you want somebody to help hold that space with you, please feel free to tag me. I will be there to hold you, send you so much love, and support you in any ways that I can.